Great, thank you very much. So good afternoon, everyone, and really a very warm welcome to this first webinar session in which we carry our usual City Debates Conference, the yearly conference that's usually organized by the Department of Architecture and Design, the Masters in Urban Planning and Policy at AUB, and that we've had to carry this year online. So for us, it's a very special moment because it's also the first webinar series that's organized by the Beirut Urban Lab, which is a research center that we recently established with my colleagues, Mona Harib, Ahmed Gharbiye, and Huwaid Al-Harithi at AUB, and very much with the organizing committee of City Debates, which includes also, in addition to us, my colleague Hiba Bouakar and Luna Dayak, who all of you or many of you have met through the City Debates organizing. So on behalf of everyone there, really, thank you so much for attending this afternoon. I'm taking a bit of time to start because it gives our colleagues who are waiting for electricity some time to switch. I think we can though start. We're super proud to carry City Debates. Just two words about City Debates for those of you who may have heard about the webinar but not the conference itself. City Debates is a yearly conference that's organized at AUB and in which we seek to engage colleagues from numerous contexts, essentially from the Global South, but also beyond, and of course from the region and from Lebanon, touching every year on an important question that we feel is transformative for our context. So over the past few years, we've addressed issues like urban heritage, post-disaster recovery, innovative methods in urban design, but also urban social movements, or again, religious movements and how they change the city and its inhabitants' life. This year, we were hoping to tackle the issue of financialization, particularly in how it has affected cities, their public spaces, and essentially their housing stocks. Of course, financialization seemed pretty apocalyptic already back last summer in Beirut, when we began to draw parallels between how 1 in 5 apartments in Beirut was empty when people direly needed homes, and how much of that was actually triggered by the interventions of banks, financial investors, and others in the housing market, turning the city's housing stock into what we call safety deposit boxes instead of homes. It seemed crazy then, but in hindsight, today, it seemed like we were doing great. With the biggest financial meltdown the country's ever seen, huge social protests, and the COVID, it seems like we were doing really well last year. So we're very excited to be able to put back this issue on the table and to put it in parallel with other countries that have undergone similar experiences, really. And so that's why for us today, more than ever, we felt that despite everything we're living, massive electricity cutoffs, internet that's flaky, and of course, the devaluation of the country by, I don't know, 6-7 folds in just 3 months, we felt that we really needed to talk about this issue again. And so to talk about it, introduce the speakers and start this discussion, I'm going to leave the floor to my colleague, Huwaid Al-Harithi, who will introduce the speakers and chair the session. Thank you again for making it, and thank you for everyone I forgot to thank, including all the City Debates participants who are showing an incredible generosity in joining us in these sessions. You're muted, Huwaida.
Thank you, Mona, so much. Thank you, everybody, for joining us for this webinar. I'd like to take a couple of minutes to introduce the first speaker, and then I'll introduce our two discussants in time. I'm very, very pleased to be here and to chair this session. I would like to maybe not give all the due introduction to our guest, but I will briefly mention a short bio to introduce her to those who don't know her work. And we have, of course, more elaborate information on our website. Raquel Rolnik is a professor at the Faculty of Architecture and Urban Planning at the University of Sao Paulo. She's an architect and an urban planner with over 35 years of scholarship, activism, and practical experience in planning, urban land policy, and housing issues. She held various government positions, including director of the planning department of the city of Sao Paulo and national secretary for the urban programs of the Brazilian Ministry of Cities. She's the author also of many books and articles on financialization on housing and urban policies, including Urban Warfare, Housing in the Age of Finance. She will talk to us today for about 30 minutes before we give the floor to our two wonderful discussants, who I will introduce later. So I would like to save the time and give the floor to Raquel. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Hello, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Who knows what time are you everywhere? This is one of the good things, but also the bad things about living the pandemic, to be everywhere and nowhere at the same time, to be at all time zones in a very, very weird, suspended virtual time. I would like to thank a lot to Mona Fawaz and the Urban Lab of the American University of Beirut for this opportunity to share some reflections on this very difficult moment we are passing through in our planet. And I would like to raise as a provocation for our debate in these 30 minutes, basically three postulates, I would say that. First, the idea that the pandemic is not the crisis. The sanitary crisis is not the crisis, but the pandemic arrives amidst a crisis which is broader and structural, and the pandemic and the virus is the expression of the crisis. And I will come back on that. Second point, the post-pandemic scenario is being disputed now during the pandemic. And the post-pandemic scenario is to be defined. So this is the second point, and I would also elaborate on that. And then the third, I think it's very important to position myself in this debate and in the field. We are thinking from the standing point of the capitalism periphery, where I place myself, a Brazilian scholar, Latin American scholar, but I imagine that we could place also Lebanon in the same place, but we are not talking about ourselves as a sort of case studies of a general theory that was produced in the center of capitalism. But I think from our point of view, we can very easily also elaborate on global issues on the planet, and we're gonna talk on that. So the first thing, the idea that we are living through a global crisis. A global crisis of what? A global crisis of neoliberalism, globalization, and financialization, and the three of them are absolutely entangled together because this is the contemporary version, hegemonic contemporary version of capitalism. So we are talking, what is in crisis today and what is in deep crisis? We are talking about a structural way of organizing production. We are talking about a relationship with territories and among people themselves. So I'm talking about not only the environmental dimension of the crisis, the economic dimension of the crisis, but also the political dimension of the crisis. So first, and we can see signs of how much neoliberalism is in crisis everywhere. For instance, with the rise of nationalist policies like Trump or Brexit against one of the principles of neoliberalism, which is the total openness of frontiers for the free circulation of goods and capital. But mostly, we before the pandemic, we were seeing also the crisis through revolts, popular revolts everywhere. And I can, for instance, give you the example of Chile and revolts against non-fulfilled promises. What were the non-fulfilled promises? Was that the market would be able to provide everything for all. So the good example is that, yeah, the market will provide you education, the market will provide health, the market will provide pension. So let's destroy any policies of state-led provision of these common goods. Let's commodify and transform in financial assets everything. And water, I think it's a good example of how much something which is absolutely essential for life is being transformed into a commodity and attached to financial global circuits. So the main important thing is not if there is or not clean water available for everybody and the protection of watersheds and financials, but the more important thing is how much is the earning in New York Stock Exchange of water companies. So we are talking about a process that, yes, began with enclosures and the definition of one and only relationship with the territory, which is private property or freehold, that was very revolutionary at the time, breaking with aristocrat and monarchical relationship with land and labor by the time, but also that came not only as a new relationship with land, but also as a new model of political organization of society in each, and we call it in Portuguese, democracia de proprietários, freeholders democracy, which is the idea that free people, freeholders of land and space are together, coming together to build up a political regime. And that model spread over the planet as the one and only model, a model in which every piece of land should be mathematically registered in a way that could be connected with value and money and fluxes of value and money. And that model was superimposed over the existing previous tenure systems everywhere. Of course, through colonialism, and I know that you know very well what I'm talking about. Initially, real occupation in order to extract wealth and disseminate a political economic model, but at some point also military occupation was no longer necessary because a local system of governance led by local elites loyal to the model and its principle was able to guarantee that the same model should be implemented over and over. So now we are talking not about colonialism, but we are talking about coloniality, which means that every other way of organizing lives and territories that it's not that has not an immediate coincidence with the one and only model of organizing space and territory has been residualized, has been stigmatized, sometimes including destroyed, and or became also increasingly illegal. And there are several names for that. Of course, we are talking about indigenous ways and traditional tenure systems and ways of dealing with territories, but increasingly over time, we are talking about very important part of urban, very important part of cities that we call settlements or informal. So we are talking about these nameless cities that are presently vis-a-vis to this overall prevalent hegemonic model of producing cities that is absolutely directed to promote growth, to promote consumption, to promote circulation and production of goods and reproduction of labor in order to be able to guarantee this permanent and infinite level of production. So all these parts of the cities as being inserted, and urban planning is absolutely central because urban planning provides the language and sets the borders to define what parts of the city are part of the model and what parts of the city are in a state of some sort of permanent temporariness, that it's there, but nobody knows if it's there for good. Nobody knows if it's there to endure forever. Nobody knows if it is legal or not, if it is part of the city or not. But at the same time, this does not mean only the conflict between urban planning and the making of the city by the majority sometimes of the population, but also we are talking about a political economy of cities in which a permanent perimeter is demarcated, in which the rule of law fades according to negotiated arrangements with the state. So we are talking about parts of the city that live in a permanent kind of state of exception, where law can be applied or not, where services can be available or not, depending on the type of arrangements that is permanently made. Yes, those are the places where the workforce lives. Those are the places, and we have clearly a racial composition and a racial component on that since the beginning, since colonialism. We are talking about neighborhoods and cities where non-white, Black, or indigenous populations live. So I think it's important to think about this model and where this model has taken us so far now. So the last phase of this, what I call hegemonic model, is what we call financialization of the production of cities. So built space became a place to park capital, to absorb surplus capital, and more to provide a ground for financial capital to obtain revenue, to obtain interest to the invested capital, which within the idea of globalization and neoliberalization became a more and more globalized and more linked to a very large scale cloud of financial capital, which is floating over the planet, and it's more and more linked to built space. Land and real estate became more and more meaningful to the financial circuit, central to the process of finance appreciation. I don't have time to elaborate on that, and maybe we can do that more in our discussion. But we are talking about that process in a very new scale, which is a mass of surplus. But also we are talking about a process that now is very much quick, intense, and rapid due to the electronic management of the flows of capital. Financial capitals from everywhere are able to enter and exit from the built space in a bit. And of course, that has transformed a lot the landscape of our cities towards rent-seeking landscapes. I think shopping malls was one of the first products that were launched into these new connections of real estate and financial capital. And that created a ground on an experiment of how cities should be organized that had influenced much more in a much more wide scale afterwards, and we're going to come back to that. So the idea and urban policy has been, and state has been very, very active on submitting the entire logic of building cities to the desires of return over the invested capital. So the main question for urban planning and urban policies was not what are the needs of the people? What do we need to provide as a city for all? No, the main question is, and the main mantra of urban policies has been in the last period, that the best use of one particular spot or place is the use that provides more return to the invested capital. Well, the result of that has been everywhere, global north, global south, everywhere, a housing emergency, everywhere, because of the taking over, particularly of the residential markets, by also these flows, with several different strategies, and one of them, the more recent strategies, through platform economies, through the possibilities of extracting rent by managing flows of capital coming and going from the built space, including flows of people circulating. So Airbnb, for example, is a good example of these new connections. And those new connections mean and require intense circulation, rapid circulation, but with one big problem, which is those who are not circulating, those who have not financial capital, like ourselves, where we're going to live, where we're going to survive, and how we're going to survive. So we are talking about a process that also through digital economy were transforming our society from a written society to a cyber oral digital economy, which is pretty much immaterial and commanded by financial arrangements like real estate investment funds, equity funds, and other forms of financial command of the work. And we can have a lot of other examples of how much the city was already in a process of transforming by those fluxes, like Uber, like delivery of food, and this highly exploitative process of self-employment linked to a financial circuit command. And to arrive in a position where one of the main revenues is exactly to extract profit from data, and data on the basis of consumption, and promoting data in the act of consumption being the leading biopolitical form of control of the bodies. So I'm developing all that in order to show how those changes already before the of the pandemic. And more, the idea is that the bodies ourselves, we ourselves are the ones that are promoting and delivering data that is becoming more and more a source of revenue for financial immaterial fluxes. So these new trends have combined with the old trends of organizing cities. For instance, the systems of mobility absolutely based on oil extraction, on the use of fuel, how much they are absolutely toxic in terms of promoting death and sickness because of pollution, but also because of car crash and all sorts of things like that. And I could bring here a lot of other examples on how much toxic has been our hegemonic model of building cities and creating and managing cities. So, and together with that, the speed, the intensity of circulation, the scale of production has become, I think, finally, the pandemic, which means the extreme expression of something that was already in place. And together with that, we have an environmental crisis. We have a political crisis when people in the streets of Chile said, okay, the promises were not fulfilled, and you can see that these revolts everywhere. So we are talking about a model that seems, depending on the specific time of timing of different experiences of different countries, were implemented through the 80s, the 90s, the early 2000s, that were, okay, now everybody will be happy forever because now everybody will have access to all the commodities managed by the market. And since the result is a disaster, since the result is a housing emergency, since the result is that I cannot have access to water because I cannot pay the bill, since we had an increasing inequality, an increasing taking over of our cities by international financial fluxes, and in the opening, Mona was pointing out how much empty spaces are there and we don't have where to live. So now we arrive in the pandemic, and the pandemic brings us two scenarios, and that is my last point on this talk, to our discussion. I think it brings a totally dystopic scenario and maybe a new utopia. So let's talk about the dystopian scenario. So if we think that what kills the bodies and the prevalent model becomes now the central, the bodies connected by digital culture and economy, and now those bodies are the agents of death. So this new configuration between mankind and machines also is a response to a situation where bodies together in a space can contaminate and can kill each other. And what comes as a solution, or an urban solution, or a governance solution to this type of question? Confinement, yes, but also old experience that came from previous experience. So what the previous experience can bring us? So I'm talking about shopping malls instead of open markets, gated communities, and other types of private regimes of territorial control in which high-tech technologies using cyber digital technology are the ones to provide the control of the space. But also, so this is part of the artifact, the idea that I am protected and controlled at the same time. But also, it's important to say that under the social hierarchy, we have, and that became even more acute during the pandemic, those to be protected in isolation and those to be meant to die. So we are talking about a acuteness and the race of necropolitics, which is a very good definition, for instance, of what is our President Bolsonaro policy in Brazil. Yes, go ahead and die, because some people will die. But also a scenario where exceptional measures, exactly the kind of ones that were experimented in some state of exception perimeters, like favelas in São Paulo, like refugee camps in other places, now are taken as policy. We can use the example of China, of Korea, on how much measures of control and interference and confinement is being mobilized now as a strategy to protect people from the disease, from COVID-19. But clearly, in the case of São Paulo, but also this is the case of New York, for instance, the neighborhoods that concentrate disproportionately more cases of COVID-19 are the ones where the workers of essential services, the ones that were obliged to work and to circulate during the pandemic, live. So yes, again, yeah, we are talking about neighborhoods with lack of sanitation, of lack of formal work, or lack of adequate urban conditions. And we are talking about the historical struggle, at least since the 60s, the 70s, of integration of those settlements into the mainstream model, territorial inclusion as the utopias that we had and we fought for many decades, which has implied always in the affirmation of the mainstream hegemonic model, which implies an extractive, toxic, and dispossessive logic. So now, observing during the pandemic, what is going on at popular territories, what is going on where the places where most of the people live and are trying to survive. We see the networks of solidarity, of protection, of self-defense, what we call the makeshift cities, now is the makeshift public policies, a story that we know very well with lack of resources, but putting in place strategies in deep dialogue with the realities and not as a spaceship landing in the territory in total denial of its logic. I'm talking about housing policies or urban policies centrally defined that promote basically urban products related to chains, and housing policies are typical, related to the construction industry, to the real estate industry and the financial industry, and not really with the needs of the people on the ground. So we are talking about that. We are talking about the idea of affirming freehold, but freehold has been always a kind of mirage of a gerund tense of the verb, something that is there, but somewhere never really achieved. We are talking about subalternity, a subalternity, that very important part of the subalternity is the reaffirming of the hegemonic model. So now I come to finish with this provocation, with the idea of possible utopias on that. Possible utopias, what do we want after the pandemic? We want a New Deal to reproduce the same model, more of the same, or we want, and we see the pandemic and all the crises, the crisis of neoliberalism, the crisis of globalization, the crisis of financialization as an opportunity to break the cycle, to let the political and territorial imagination to lead us, to deeply understand other logics and other ways of organizing lives and territories that were experienced many times, many decades, and are being experienced and lived now. Our capacity of inventing multiple forms of living, our capacity of producing landscapes, not for profit, not for revenue, but landscapes to protect and to promote life. I think this is the utopia which is on the table, and the responsibility to embark and to create it is really only in our hands. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Raquel, so much. Wow. Thank you. I'm sure we have a lot of questions lingering, and I hope people will send them in. I'll take this opportunity to thank you so much for a very provocative intervention, and invite our two discussants who will speak for about 5 to 7 minutes each before we open the floor for general questions and discussions. Allow me, please, to introduce them both at one go and then give them the floor. We have Cesar De Felice Antonio, who is a lecturer in human geography at Manchester Metropolitan University, and who's currently a recipient of the Marie Sklodowska-Curie Actions Individual Fellowship. In 2017, Cesar was awarded the prize of the Global Network on Financial Geography for the best PhD thesis defended in 2016. He was also awarded in 2018 the Gabriele Zanetto Prize from the Association of the Italian Geographers for Best Early Career Geography. He is the co-editor of ACME, an international journal for critical geographies, and his work has also been published in different venues, among which are Antipods, Cities, Environment and Planning, European Urban Regional Studies, Geoforum, and many others. With him, we will have my colleague Mona Fawaz, who's a professor of urban studies and planning and the coordinator of the graduate programs in urban planning, policy, and design at the American University of Beirut. She's also a co-director of the Beirut Urban Lab, a recently established research center that engages policymakers, activists, and researchers in Lebanon and the region on questions of urban inclusion and post-conflict recovery. Fawaz also leads the urban track at the Issam Fares Institute of Public Policy at the American University of Beirut, and is a fellow affiliated with the Lebanese Center for Policy Studies. She was actually a fellow at the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Studies at Harvard University during the academic year of 2014-15. With that, I leave the floor to Cesar and Mona, and hopefully receive questions from the audience. Cesar, floor is yours.
Thank you very much for the nice words and presentation. Hope everyone can hear me well. Yeah, I mean, that's the weird thing of presenting online. So thank you. First of all, thank you for the invitation. And thanks, Raquel, for this very inspiring presentation. I mean, as you can understand, it's not easy to discuss. And I mean, there were so many things, some interesting and very important points. So I will just try to kind of touch upon some of them, the one especially that maybe talk a bit more about, also resonate a bit more with my work and my own approach. The first point I would like to touch upon is the one sentence that really kind of resonate with me that Raquel said. So the post-pandemic period is to be defined. And for me, this is the key, because I mean, in the last months, we have we read so many different contributions about the transformation of power and new forms of control and surveillance kind of emerging. And I mean, coming also from a background, there's an intersection of urban studies, but also kind of queer and feminist approaches. For me, it's very important to avoid what Cedric would have defined as kind of paranoid thinking. So it's very important to see the present as open, because as Raquel was brilliantly highlighting, I mean, the present has to be defined because different forms of resistance, of conflict are brought by different actors. I mean, of course, it doesn't mean that we have to underestimate power and the violence and the structural force of power, but it means that we have to acknowledge also our own constitutive role in what's going on in society, both as kind of academics, but also as activists, or more general as citizens. So for me, that was a very important point. And a second related to that, also maybe it's more like a question for Raquel to answer, because so she was reflecting upon around necropolitics, and I think it's very important to think about necropolitics. But also, I mean, when hearing words about necropolitics, what I was reminded was about, I mean, the nature of sovereignty, of the sovereign power of the state. That if we think about sovereignty is also somehow, I mean, I wrote in my notes, it's a power over life. And one of the main things emerging in the current situation is how, I mean, specific lives, the lives that have in some countries have been labeled as essential workers, are disposable lives, who somehow are lives claiming for visibilities, because of those lives that are usually invisible. And I mean, if we look at data around mortality rates, inequalities in mortality rates, I mean, we can see how all those social inequalities around invisibilities and lack of access to specific basic rights and resources leads to different mortality rates. Okay, so I think it's very important to reflect upon those inequalities also when thinking about the post-pandemic and the post-pandemic future. So how, in a situation as the one described by Raquel, can these people claim back that visibility and those access, access more resources, but also claim back powers? Also in that case, I mean, we're seeing in all over the news, I mean, what's going on in the US. I mean, so it's extraordinary what is going on, because of course it's in the situation of post-pandemic, it's a way to reclaim that kind of visibility that the present hegemonic model is denying them. At the same time, I mean, all over the world, I mean, there are other forms of visibility reclaimed by different movements and different actors. So let's think, for instance, about women and how, I mean, the pandemic present has led to increasing domestic violence rates in many different places. So how also in many places women are claiming back rights to basic rights and visibility to fight what is going on. I mean, on the same time, I think that when thinking about the post-pandemic future, it's also important to, I mean, to think about, okay, so what is going to, I mean, how is the city of the very next future going to be shaped like, going to be look like? Because one of the things that, you know, is most striking is how under the current situation, I mean, still in, I mean, I'm based in the UK and I'm Italian, so I'm more familiar with the Italian context of the UK, also let's say the European one. So one of the things that struck me more here is how, despite the current situation, there is a huge defense of rents and property. I mean, rent and property, I mean, no one really is, in terms of no one informal institution, is disputing the importance to defend rent. So in many countries, like for instance in the Italian case, I mean, now the government, as a way to fuel growth in the very next future, so is suggesting to actually almost entirely pay for the property market to grow again. Okay. So I think we need to ask ourselves, I mean, how can we challenge these, the hegemony of rent and property in a different scale, because it's both in a more general sense, so in terms of laws, but it's also now in our own approach as individuals, because I mean, my perspective is one that somehow comes from Foucauldian approaches. So I don't see ourselves as individuals here today, I mean, completely disembedded from the structures that constitute society. So I think we are embedded in those structures. So we have to ask ourselves, so how do we challenge that hegemony of rent and property in our daily lives, and how can we support other actors to challenge that? So I mean, I would say that that's another question that I have for Raquel when thinking about the post-pandemic future. So which forms of, you know, social interaction and different forms of social relation can we imagine to support a challenge to the existing models? And another point, and that's my last one I would like to reflect on, is about platform capitalism, because I think, again, I think it's one of the key issues, and again also because it involves us as everyday actors. So again, how we can challenge that power, also knowing that thanks to some of these technologies and some of these platforms, specific movements, specific forms of mobilization and contestation are able to rise and connect more quickly. So which kind of alternative forms can we kind of think for the next future? So I mean, I know that maybe I have opened even more kind of questions rather than try to address some answers to the ones posed by Raquel, but I think it's very important that when thinking about what is at stake now, here and now, I mean, we think about all these different issues. So thank you very much for this opportunity.
Should I jump in and add, or do you want to respond first, Raquel?
I think you should give your bit, and then I'll give the floor to Raquel to respond to the question.
Sure.
Better. Yeah, it's better to hear you. Yeah.
All right. Well, let me first thank you, Raquel, very much for this big overview of the current moment and its historical roots, and for putting these points on the table. And really, thank you, Cesare, for picking on some of the very same things that I felt very strongly I wanted to raise. I first want to first point out the extent to which, despite the different positions in which we all are, how much is actually in common and how much echoes there is here from our local experience. I speak of our context in the Arab Middle East, where so much of this history of property that came with the colonial moment begins to transform the relationship between people and land, whether it's land as home or as agrarian natural landscapes. And the extent to which this has come back to the fore now during the moment of the pandemic, which is coupled in Lebanon with a very specific thing, which is the financial meltdown. Lebanon defaulting for the first time on its foreign debt, and basically coming into a position where for a moment, everyone feels maybe we have to plant the land to eat. We can't anymore survive on the rentier model that we used to live. But then land is property, and what we find is that the work of moving people off the land, dismantling the infrastructures that created those livelihoods 100 years ago, are actually extremely powerful. And consequently, the ability to return to the land, to imagine a possibility through which one can create a different livelihood, has become extremely difficult. Of course, in the cities, we see an even more intensive process where informal settlements and refugee camps, and you know there's very large refugee camps in Lebanon today. 1 in 4 people is actually a refugee in the country. So what we see is a moment of very strong interest in those areas. And for a second, a lot of us were saying, okay, so this is the moment where we're going to imagine a better future, because they're seeing them finally. We've been saying integrate refugee camps, de-densify informal settlements, care for them, and suddenly they cared for them. They were worried. They don't have water, they can't wash their hands, the density is very high, the pandemic is gonna hit all of us here. And for a second, we said, okay, the financial system is breaking down. Everything we used to do is not working anymore. No one will want to buy property. And on top of things, we're going to care for the refugees. But actually, in hindsight, we were very, what am I going to say, very naive. Because what we've seen 3 months into the game is actually a consolidation and a strengthening of every single thing we thought was dismantled, to the point that today, in imagining how they will not be hungry, even Lebanese colleagues, progressive colleagues, think that the arrival of the IMF is our only salvation. And so we are dreaming of sort of a rescue package from the IMF. And this is where I want to connect to what Cesare was saying, and the moment you close, Raquel, by really asking you, in your experience, all this involvement you had in the public sector, trying really to change the structures and get people to accept the possibility of doing things differently. How come does it work that in terms of neoliberalism, we see the lessons, the convergences, the same language, the same actor, it works perfectly. These guys do it perfectly. While for those of us who think of ourselves as progressive academics, people who want to disrupt the system, to put on the table alternatives, lesson sharing is harder, mobilizing is very disheartening. And so it's like, what can you really build on? Where do you really start in creating these possible things? Are there certain alliances that in your experience can be formed between academics and others that can empower us to, if not resist, at least put some pillars for an alternative? Knowing that very much the landscape you're describing, property policed, data controlled, top-down, quite hands-on governments, quite repressive, increasingly repressive, in fact, are the landscape of also the region and the context in which we are. So I think I'll stop here because I'm seeing also a lot of questions. But I really hope that it's not sounding as pessimistic as I'm feeling I am, but it is a very difficult moment here. And so we're looking to learn from elsewhere, perhaps possibilities and options for how to think differently, imagine differently the moment.
So Raquel, back to you. The floor is yours. I think you have a lot of interesting questions thrown at you, so please go ahead. You're muted, Raquel.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, sorry. Thank you, Cesare. Thank you, Mona, for your question. I wish I had answer to this. Those are the questions. Those are the questions. But in order to take that, I would quote an Italian philosopher, Franco Berardi. Neoliberalism is dead. We are living in a corpse. That's why it's so unpleasant to start with. What I say, it's true that what is on the table now in terms of power structure is more of the same. So basically, we're going to see, and we started already to see in many countries, say, yes, let's open a new frontier for the real estate industry. The real estate industry can provide jobs very quickly, and that will come with an economic dynamic, and at the same time, and this is the discourse, will provide housing for all the dispossessed. And we know the story. We know the story because we have seen this movie many, many times in history. So the paradigm, the model of promoting more dispossession by, at the same time, using all the language of the pandemic to see, you see how bad protected were the people in the irregular, informal settlements. Those settlements should not exist anymore. Let's destroy them and build back better. Build back better for whom? So let's just see the history of that. Haussmann plans for Paris, post-Spanish flu, post-malaria and yellow fever in many of our cities in late 19th, early 20th century. What is the story? Again and again and again is the destruction of people's assets, the places where they used to build and live in order to open ground to a new frontier and to provoke more exclusion, more precarity, more temporariness. So this is history. This is history. So I think we have and this is very challenging. I think we have to be very careful on building a discourse saying, yes, the problem of the pandemic are the informal settlements. Because then you can put on the table the justification for the next move, which is dispossession, which is using that. So it's tricky because yes, inequality is there. Yes, there is lack of sanitation. Yes, but it's not only that. There is much more in the popular economy than that, much more. And we need to highlight that. I think it's very important. And when you place the question, all the rentier economy, which is basically a rentier economy, needs desperately space and land. So in a way, every piece of land which is occupied with different purposes and different logic is a standpoint, is very important for the struggle to overcome. Every resistance to eviction, every resistance to stay put, every permanence on what should be temporary on this war over space are very important. So, and why I'm saying that, and then taking the question that was raised by Mona, after being part of state at local level, municipal level, or at national level, myself, I realized how much states became part of the corporation logic, and how much is difficult. And that was precisely, I know that I'm part of a urban reform movement, a Brazilian urban reform movement that put a lot of energy on institution and institutional building and making of new legislation and making of new public policies in order to address the needs of the majority, and how much the structures of the state and the way the state is organized has sabotaged our means all the time, because the machinery is a machinery that was not meant to do that. That's why I pointed out during my talk of the relationship between a certain economic model, a certain economic type of property, and a certain political mode of representation. We are talking about a package, a combo. It's a combo. It's the same thing. It's not possible to overcome that going in a little piece of the combo. That helped us to explain how much progressive governments in Latin America, we have a lot of examples of that, how much progressive governments have introduced financialization of housing. So I think it's now, of course, what the future and the new model, because I'm talking about the crisis, the deep crisis of a model that was invented 250, 300 years ago during the Enlightenment, and it was revolutionary at the time, and we need another revolution and another model, because this model, it's not functional anymore. So I think then an opportunity for alliances are there. And what are the opportunities of alliances, in my view? First of all, environmental struggles. I mean, this is not theoretical, it's empirical. The earth is melting. The water is, there is no more clean water. I mean, it's totally empirical. I know that Trump and also Bolsonaro don't believe, they think it's not true, but it is, because we are seeing, we are living that. We have seen those disasters in our lifetime. So I think it's a very strong and powerful quest for a different mode. And I see also, and this is, I think it's very important at this moment in terms of alliances. This model, this hegemonic model, and thank you, Cesare, for bringing this also on the table, is not only racist, is also patriarchalist. So, as well as all the struggles against racism at this moment are very structural and very important in order to criticize and point out many other dimensions of that. So I think also, and I hate when traditional left organizations take those topics as identity struggles. I don't think they are identity struggles. They are structural struggles. They are absolutely structural. And someday, sometime, the squatter movement will meet with the environmental movement, will meet with the women's movement, will meet with the struggles against racism and other struggles at the territorial level in order to overcome of that. In this meantime, that's what is important. I don't think that this is a platform to win next election. Yeah, we're gonna lose next election and probably the following elections as well. But that does not mean that a new consciousness and a new Utopia is arising. Why? Because different, and I'm going to finish on that, different from the movements, the revolutionary movements that we had in the cycle of revolutionary movements in 19th century and early 20th century, that basically fought to have an agenda and to dispute at the political level in order to take over the state, in order to implement the agenda. Now it's very different. Now, what I see as a most promising movement is changing their lives and their way of living now, today, and trying to do that in a different way in the relationship between the other, within the social relations, but also within territories, trying to make land be possible to provide food security, trying to make land in order to provide housing security and protection, and many, many others, I think, things that are happening already now. They are probably minoritary today, but someday they will provide the ground to a big encounter and the possibility of change. And because we are in an urban lab and an urban planning discussion, urban planning must do a very deep criticism on its practices. I think it's very important to open and the discussion, the coloniality discussion of urban planning, I think it's very central to that. That can be perhaps our contribution also to this movement or to this change or to this making on a new utopia.
Thank you, Raquel, so much. I think you covered the next question, which was asked by Mona Harb, partially asked by Cesar as well, but I want to throw it because part of it maybe is not addressed. You started addressing it now by commenting on where urban planning should go. The question is, please, can you elaborate on possible modalities to imagine this utopia? That's the part I think Cesar asked and you covered a little bit. And how would you see the role of the university/academia in this process? So if you want to add anything, I think you've already touched on some of it.
No, thank you. Thank you for this question. I think that in terms of thinking and imagining policies, what is and what it means to think out of the box, out of the box, is that, and I think it's very important this for maybe for Lebanon as it is for Latin America. It's like the whole profession of urban planning, of architecture, in the periphery of capitalism has been, we want to be like the European cities or the North American cities are. So what do you want, like when you ask a child, what do you want to be when you grow up? Oh, I want to be Paris. I want to be New York. I want to be London. So now it's time to say, we don't want to be Paris, New York, London. And then a whole openness of what we want to be can be on the table and can be put on the table. Part of it has to do with our own culture, our own way of organizing space and life, with our past experiences and our present experience. Part of it can be that, but part of it can be also for really understanding that this model, again, is a combo. This model, behind the model, there is everything that are putting our lives in danger now. Pollution, environmental footprint, overbuilding, and so on and on and on. So I think that coming from that point of view, we have a challenge. And as university, I think we are very, very well positioned in order to think about that. Because first of all, we are paid to reflect. We are paid to be able to show, and Thank you, Cesare, for bringing the issue of invisibility. Let's make visible the invisible. Let's make the actors and the subjects that has been always subjects with no voice, with voiceless, let's hear them. Let's make them be the front of the policy and the policy discussion, and not the object of it, and not the ones that the centrally defined policy is meant for. So I think all the experiences that are in place in our universities, in architecture and urban planning universities, I know that there is a lot of experiences to work together and to try to understand in a different way. They are very, very meaningful at this moment. And it's a role for the university not only to do that, to be involved in that, but also to systematize, analyze, and provide lessons from that.
Thank you again. And before I read you the second question, I just want to note that what you're predicting is already happening. I am stranded in Saudi Arabia. I came here to attend juries and I've been here 4 months. I am witnessing the removal of many informal settlements. Just the government has already gone in under the framework of COVID-19 and wiping out high density informal settlements. And I'm sure that it's not for any public health reasons, but for future development, because these are inner city informal settlements. And the property there is very expensive. So it's already happening in some places. And it's a scary prospect of what's to come next. I have one hand raised, and if the person whose hand is up wishes to share the question, unmute them.
Hello, am I audible?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you, Raquel. This is fascinating, and it's nice to kind of have a face to the person whose book I'm already reading, Urban Warfare. And I had like one quick question, primarily around the last point which you made around the whole obsession with the freehold or the ownership, particularly. So I have been also like dwelling upon particularly on the thought of what is the way forward, right? Like there is a rental housing, which is so much a need, particularly for the migrants who cannot fix a static location, who are, many of them are on the move, or even for the middle income housing or the youth from middle income groups. So the idea of rental housing or collective ownerships, where the whole CLT model and the different manifestations of community land trust models in different cities can serve as alternative ways of looking at housing injustices that are happening in our cities. So I was also wondering, like looking from the pandemic scenario, of course, the whole market boom is going to further take its place by eviction and creating this whole edifices of neoliberalism. So like, I was wondering if you can share a bit light, throw some light on the alternatives towards looking at new models of housing, and if you can suggest some examples I can tap into and further read about. And yeah, thanks.
Thank you. Thank you for the question. It's a very, very good and important question. In terms of housing policies and housing strategies, and my whole book, Urban Warfare, is an account of that, is how much ownership and private ownership of housing became the one and only model everywhere in all the countries, and how much this was part of the taking over of finance over the residential sector, and the result, which was the burst and the crisis and the financial crisis and the mortgage crisis in the places where this was very acute, and the destruction of all others housing policies that were not were not promoted under this model. But what happens is that after the mortgage crisis, the financial crisis, then a new wave of financialization of residential housing came on rental housing this time. That's why it's important to discuss rent, because not by chance, again, we see World Bank and international cooperation agencies talking about rental policies that should be in place in many, many countries. And we see a new kind of landlord emerging, which is the corporate landlord, which is a equity fund or a financial fund with thousands and thousands. And there is examples in US and Spain, for instance, of Blackstone, who owns more than 100,000 homes, rental homes, that enter into the market that had collapsed with the financial crisis and basically bought the foreclosure stock from the hand of the banks, eventually bought also in countries like Sweden, for instance, or Germany, public housing, buildings and complexes that became private rental housing with this corporate landlord, with a lot of pressure on tenants, especially migrant tenants, low-income tenants that cannot afford the rent and are under threat of evictions or were actually evicted. So we have to be very, very careful with the idea of promoting rent at this moment and really talking about what kind of rent we are talking about. Yes, at the same time, it's true that rent, including in informal settlements, are on the rise, rental schemes, because of lack of other possibilities for the people and because of the revenues that rental can bring to the families that own a piece of land of their own. So it's very, very significant, and it's not at all protected. Sometimes it's absolutely wild, without contract, without any types of protection. But having said that, I think that one of the movements that are interesting, it's on the rise, and I see that in UK, clearly I see that in the US as well. I see that in Spain, like 3 countries where the movement of renters movement in Germany, in Denmark, in many countries, in order to protect rent and establish caps on rents and other policies in order to protect rent. So rent dwellers movements are, I forgot to mention, one of those alliances also that could be very important to connect social movements around rental housing together with social movements against evictions and erasures of informal settlements, together with the other ones that I mentioned. But so I think to think about rent, to understand what's going on with the rental market, it's very important now, and maybe also this is a very important line of investigation for the university hours. We are doing also that in order to understand and much more that. But also the other types of tenure that you mentioned, all types of collective cooperative ownership, this is also on the rise, not only community land trust, but cooperative housing. So forms of collective owning that in a way protect land and real estate from the speculative attacks of the financial market. I think these are also very interesting alternatives for now. And I think that there are a lot of experiences already, and it's, again, a global movement that can, I think, also put on the table other forms of tenure. Because, I mean, why private property? Maybe private property can be one model, but why should be the one and only? That's the question. Why not having other forms?
Okay, I think we can take one more question, which dovetails really well with your comments just now. And it's a question that is asked around the Egypt case. I think I will summarize a little bit the question that says, you know, on the one hand, the government in Egypt evicts people from lands and dwellings in order to increase its bankable land and property. And on the other hand, it announces some urban development projects as initial public offerings, i.e. allows multinational corporations and large businesses to buy shares in these projects. So the question that Dalia Wahdan sends would go, would you think that one way to subvert the system is to widen the base of buyers to include the marginalized and evictees? That's the question.
Thank you. Yeah, I think it's incredible how much everywhere is the same policy. Everywhere is the same policy. In one time, evicting and raising in order to open space for land, to offer land for real estate financial complex to use and take over. In another hand, to offer opportunities of buying through subsidized credit or credit in a better conditions for those who are not, including, like in the case of Brazilian program Minha Casa Minha Vida, My House My Life, including almost subsidized entirely the house for the people to be able to buy from private developers. The complexes. What is the question with that? The question is that if the whole thinking on housing should be how much this investment, this financial investment, how much this should be returned, in what time and how, you will never reach the ones who need the most. Because the ones who need the most don't have anything to pay, So the question is, why should housing be always seen as a commodity and a financial asset? Housing can be a place to live. It doesn't need to be part of a financial circuit of the economic sector. So I think that all the policies that are thought in these terms, they can, yes, amplify opportunities for people to buy, it's true, but never to those who really need. So then comes the problem. A problem is that what we are doing with that is we are raising homelessness, basically. More people without roof, more people without homes, instead of solving the question. So I don't think what is the sense of promoting policies who are not directed to those who live. And if there is public land and typically PPPs, public-private partnership, where the government provides land and the private capital, the construction, the development, and then you have credit to people to buy that. Of course, if you provide this land to cooperatives, to groups of people that are able to build their own homes with technical assistance, with some resources, it's much interesting and less expensive than doing all this logic of pulling together the land and making available the PPP, and at the end, the ones that will access those houses, because you have to remunerate the capital are not the ones that need the most. So I think we should simply empirically see what came out of these policies in order to understand that they are not sustainable.
Thank you so much, Raquel, for a most provocative and amazing intervention. Thank you, Cesar and Mona, for pushing it further. I want to thank you all, thank all the participants and the attendees, and ask you to stay tuned. We have a follow-up, and next week we'll have another webinar that takes on the topic of housing challenges in Lebanon. So you will receive our announcement really soon, and I'm super grateful. And we're closing just in time. Mona told me 7:30, so I want to thank you and leave you to say goodbye now.
Thank you very, very, very much, Mona, Cesar, Haida. It was wonderful, this opportunity. And I hope sometime we're going to meet physically, in presence, please.
Yes, we're definitely looking forward to having you in Beirut. I also want to join Huwaida really in expressing gratefulness to everyone who attended the seminar, and particularly to our discussion speaker, and really Luna behind the scene, whose face you haven't even seen and who has been doing incredible work. So thank you, everyone. And see you next week.
Thank you, everybody. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.